Deadly Love Affair, Texas Heiress and Her Young Lover's Fatal Secrets, true crime documentary. The Texas sun beat down relentlessly. The grand mansion stood in the distance, a monument to wealth and secrecy. Inside, all was pristine. The marble floors, the golden chandeliers. But behind the elegance, something darker festered. Claire Matthews, a woman with everything, had one secret. A secret so dangerous, it could destroy everything. Her affair with a young man named Chris. A man with eyes that spoke of hunger. Not just for her body, but for her life. Every meeting, a whispered thrill. The smell of jasmine clung to the air as they met in the garden. A kiss stolen behind her husband's back. The thrill was intoxicating. But the danger, always just beneath the surface. Tonight was different. The house was empty, her husband away on business. Claire had sent a text. Come over tonight. I need you. Her fingers trembled as she typed it. She couldn't explain why it felt more urgent now than ever before. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, mocking her. She could feel her pulse quicken. The doorbell rang. Her breath caught. She opened the door. Chris stood there, his presence commanding, yet dangerous. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice low. Claire hesitated. Then she stepped aside, her heart hammering. They didn't speak as they made their way upstairs. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls. When they reached the bedroom, Chris turned to her. His fingers grazed her cheek, sending chills down her spine. I've waited for this, he whispered. But as he kissed her, Claire felt something was off. His touch was too cold. Too distant. Suddenly she felt it. A strange pressure in the room. Her eyes snapped open. Chris had pulled back. She gasped. A dark glint of something, metal, caught her eye. A knife. Not in his hand, but buried deep in her husband's prized desk drawer. Her heart froze. She turned quickly, but before she could make a sound, Chris was behind her, his hand on her shoulder. You don't have to worry about him, he murmured. Claire's thoughts were racing. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't love. Then a noise. A sharp rattle of metal. The door swung open. Too late. Everything changed. The door slammed open. A figure stood in the doorway. Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was her husband, Robert. His eyes were wild, filled with disbelief. He had returned early. Her secret was exposed. Robert's voice was a low growl. What is this, Claire? He stepped inside, his gaze darting between her and Chris. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. Chris didn't move. His posture remained calm, too calm. Like this moment had been expected. Robert, Claire began, but her voice faltered. She didn't know what to say. Her mind raced. She could feel the tension in the room thickening, suffocating. Robert's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the desk, at the drawer still slightly ajar. His gaze flicked back to Chris, suspicion rising. Then, to Claire, his expression unreadable. Was this part of your plan too? Robert's words cut through the silence. Claire's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. But Chris did. He stepped forward. I think it's time we finish this, he said, his voice cold. Suddenly, Claire understood. This was no accident. Chris wasn't just a lover. He was the executioner. The gleam of the knife caught her eye again. It was no longer in the drawer. Chris had it now. Robert saw it too. He took a step back, his face draining of color. You? Robert whispered, his voice thick with shock. Claire's body trembled. She looked between the two men, fear bubbling in her chest. How had it come to this? Chris didn't wait for another word. He lunged forward. The air crackled with tension. Robert tried to fight back, but he was too slow. A flash of steel, and then a sharp cry. Claire watched in horror as Robert stumbled back, blood staining his shirt. He reached for the door, his hand clawing at the frame. But he collapsed before he could escape. The room was still, deadly still. Claire's heart hammered. Her world shattered in front of her eyes. Chris turned to her, wiping the blood from his hands. You're free now, he said with a sick smile. Claire couldn't speak. Her mind was numb. Her husband, The man she had promised to love forever was gone. Chris approached her, but she stepped back. No matter what he had promised, the terror of the moment overwhelmed her. She realized then that she was trapped in a web spun of lust, betrayal, and murder. There was no turning back. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps. Her body trembled, frozen in the cold, lifeless room. Robert lay on the floor, a pool of blood spreading across the marble. Her mind couldn't process it, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Chris took a step toward her. His eyes were cold, empty. "You wanted him gone, didn't you?" His voice was calm, almost detached, like he was discussing the weather. Her pulse thudded in her ears. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do this?" Chris tilted his head. "Why?" he repeated, as if tasting the word. "You were never going to leave him, Claire. You were always too scared. Too stuck." His eyes darkened, a glint of something dangerous flickering in their depths. "You needed someone to do the dirty work?" Her stomach churned. She felt sick, dizzy. Was he right? Had she been so blind? "Don't look at me like that," he continued, a mocking smile curling at the corners of his lips. "I gave you what you wanted." Claire staggered backward, her hand brushing against the cold wall. Everything felt unreal. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The silence in the room pressed in on her. The weight of the blood that stained the floor was suffocating. Her throat burned. Chris took another step, closing the distance between them. "I never loved you, Claire," he said, his voice now a whisper. "But I loved what you could give me." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. Claire recoiled. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped. The door was behind her, but she couldn't move. "You're mine now," Chris said softly. "You've crossed the line." The chill in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't just an affair. It was a conquest. A twisted, dark game. Her legs buckled beneath her. She sank to her knees beside Robert's body, feeling the coldness seep into her skin. Her thoughts were a whirl of panic, confusion, and guilt. But Chris wasn't done. He crouched down in front of her, his face inches from hers. "I know you didn't expect this," he said, a twisted kind of pity in his voice. "But it doesn't matter now." Claire's breath hitched. She tried to speak, but the words were stuck, choked by fear. Chris stood up, stepping back. He wiped his hands on his jeans, his expression unreadable. "It's too late to turn back," he said. "Once the blood is spilled, it can never be washed away." And then, he turned and walked toward the door. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. Was he leaving her? He paused in the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. "I'll be back for you," he said coldly. And then he was gone. The silence in the room was deafening. All Claire could hear was the ringing in her ears. Her world had shattered, and there was no going back. She was alone, and the nightmare had only just begun. Claire stayed frozen, kneeling beside Robert's lifeless body. Her mind raced, but there was nothing but a hollow emptiness. The room, once a sanctuary of wealth and opulence, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her. Her pulse was a steady drum in her ears, but it wasn't enough to drown out the horror of what had just unfolded. The smell of blood mingled with the sharp scent of her own sweat. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on her, stifling her every breath. She looked at Robert's face. He was still in the position he had fallen, eyes wide open in shock. His lips slightly parted, as if he had tried to speak but had never gotten the chance. Her hands trembled as she reached out, but she couldn't touch him, couldn't bring herself to close his eyes, to make him look at peace. The cruel truth was there, staring at her from his empty gaze. He was gone. A sudden noise broke the silence. A soft thud. Claire snapped her head toward the door. Her heart skipped a beat. Was Chris back? Had he left something behind? But no, she was alone. Yet the sound had been real. Something in the house had shifted, creaking under its own weight, as if the mansion itself was aware of the dark deed that had taken place inside it. She stood up, her legs weak, unsteady. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run as far as she could. But she was paralyzed. She couldn't move. Not while the shadows of what had happened still hung over her. The phone. She needed to call the police, to explain, no, to beg for help. But her hand hovered over it, shaking uncontrollably. Would they believe her? Would they see her as a victim, or an accomplice? Her mind kept going back to Chris's words. Asterisk, you've crossed the line. Asterisk. She had been complicit. She had let this happen. Her heart pounded, and her thoughts scrambled. She needed to get out. The mansion felt smaller with every passing second, the air suffocating. Every corner seemed to hide something, something that wasn't there before, something sinister. And then she heard it again. Another thud, followed by a faint scraping sound. This time, it was louder. It came from the direction of the stairwell. Claire's breath hitched. Her mind raced. What was it? What was coming? She moved toward the staircase, each step heavier than the last. The house felt unnaturally quiet, and yet, the shadows seemed to grow darker with every passing second. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Another scrape, closer this time. It wasn't her imagination. Someone was in the house with her. She reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched out before her, long and empty. But it didn't feel empty. The scraping noise was getting louder. Closer. Claire turned to face the bedroom at the end of the hall. She could barely see anything in the dim light, but someone was moving. A dark figure in the doorway. Her body froze. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. The figure stepped forward, and the flickering light revealed it. It was Chris. But something was different about him now. His face was twisted, a dark grin stretching across his lips. Did you think you could escape? He asked, his voice low and mocking. I told you, Claire, you're mine now. Her heart sank as the door behind him creaked open wider. The knife gleamed in his hand once again. The 911 operator's voice crackled through the phone. Ma'am, stay with me. I need you to calm down. Can you tell me where you are? Claire's fingers tightened around the phone, trying to steady herself. Her mind swirled, still trapped in the chaos of the past few minutes. She looked around the room, at the blood-soaked floor, at the bodies, at the shattered remnants of her life. Where was she? Her mouth felt dry, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of the horror. I'm at the Matthews estate, she managed, her voice a fragile whisper. The house, it's on the hill off Oak Ridge Road. Ma'am, stay on the line with me. Help is on the way. Do you have any immediate injuries? Claire glanced at herself, at the blood on her hands, her clothes, staining the pristine white carpet beneath her feet. But she didn't feel the pain. Not yet. No, she said, her voice shaky. I'm not hurt. But they are. They're both. She couldn't bring herself to say it out loud again. The words felt too heavy. The operator's voice softened. Ma'am, I need you to stay where you are. Do you have any weapons near you? Anything to protect yourself. Claire glanced down at the knife still in her hand. It was slick with blood, and she stared at it, almost as if it belonged to someone else. She didn't want it. She couldn't hold it anymore. With trembling hands, she dropped the knife to the floor. The clatter seemed deafening in the stillness. The operator's voice came through again, insistent but calm. Ma'am, are you still with me? Stay on the line. We're close. Help is close. Claire nodded, then realized she wasn't on the line with the operator. She was talking to herself. The sound of her own voice, distant and foreign, was the only thing keeping her grounded. The seconds stretched on like hours, each one heavier than the last. What happens now? She wondered. The police would come, and then what? Would they believe her? Would they see her as a victim? Or something worse? She didn't know. She had no idea what would happen next. The house felt so empty now. The silence was thick and oppressive, like a blanket smothering her. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing moment, the shadows stretching longer, darker. Her heart beat in her chest like a drum. And then, a sound. The crunch of gravel. A car's tires on the driveway. Claire's heart jumped in her throat. The police were here. But something else stirred inside her. A dark, gnawing feeling. What if Chris hadn't been the only one? What if there were others involved? Her mind flickered back to the strange noises she had heard earlier, the scraping sound, the thuds echoing through the house. What if they weren't just the sounds of her own paranoia? Was someone else still in the house? Claire's eyes darted around, scanning every corner, every shadow. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She heard voices now, faint but growing closer. Footsteps outside the door. Claire Matthews, a voice called from the hallway. It was one of the officers. She tried to stand, but her legs felt like jelly. The room spun. The weight of everything, the horror, the guilt, the fear, was crushing her. "Yes, I'm here," she called out weakly. The door creaked open, and two officers entered, their faces grim, their hands on their holsters. They stopped when they saw the scene before them. The silence stretched. One of the officers, a tall man with graying hair, stepped forward. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Claire could barely breathe. She nodded, but it wasn't the truth. She wasn't okay. She was far from it. The officer glanced at the body on the floor, Robert's, and then at Chris. He let out a slow, exhaled breath. "Ma'am, we're going to take care of this. We're going to get you out of here." But Claire wasn't sure she wanted to leave.
Not yet.
The house still felt like a prison, and she wasn't sure who, or what, was lurking inside it. "Is anyone else here?" the officer asked. Claire's heart skipped. Her mind flashed to the images of Chris, the cold, twisted smile.
I
don't know," she whispered. "I don't know." The officer gave a sharp nod to his partner, signaling for him to check the rest of the house. Claire watched them move, a strange sense of helplessness washing over her. She couldn't explain it. Couldn't explain why the hairs on her neck stood up. Why she felt like someone was still there. The officer's voice broke the silence. Clear. No one else here, just the two bodies. The tension in the room didn't ease. The weight of everything still pressed in. "Ma'am, you're safe now," the officer said, stepping closer. But Claire wasn't sure if she was safe. How could she be? She glanced at the door one last time, half expecting to see Chris standing there, his dark eyes watching her, waiting. But there was nothing. Nothing but the echo of her own thoughts. The officers moved quickly, securing the area, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the house felt charged, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something more to happen. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, deeper, and she could feel them closing in on her, creeping closer with every step the officers took. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to breathe in this house anymore, to feel the weight of the death that had occurred within these walls. One of the officers turned back to her, his eyes softening for a moment. "Ma'am, can you tell us what happened?" Claire blinked, as if waking from a nightmare. Her lips parted, but the words were stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside her chest. I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. Her voice cracked. I didn't know. I didn't know he would." She stopped herself. She didn't know what she was supposed to say. She didn't know how to explain this. The affair, the murder, Chris's twisted hold on her. None of it made sense. The officer didn't press. He simply nodded and moved to the side, allowing the paramedics to enter the room. They moved quickly, but with the careful precision of people who had seen too much, their faces hardened with the weight of the tragedy. Claire barely registered their movements. Her eyes were glued to the bodies on the floor, the blood still glistening, the scene still raw. It was as if it was happening to someone else. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and her mind spiraled into a dark whirlpool. The paramedic bent down, checking for a pulse on Robert, her husband. Her thoughts raced back to the beginning of their marriage, the promises, the dreams, the false security. How had it all gone so wrong? She didn't know. She couldn't answer that. A few moments later, the paramedic stood up and nodded grimly to his partner. The silence in the room thickened, as if everyone knew there was nothing more to be done. Time of death, approximately 30 minutes ago, the paramedic announced, his voice flat. They covered Robert's body with a white sheet, and Claire felt something inside her snap. The weight of the finality, of the coldness of it all, hit her like a freight train. She stumbled back, her hands pressed to her temples. The room was closing in again. The walls were too close. "Ma'am, we need you to step outside for a moment," one of the officers said, his voice gentle but firm. Claire nodded mechanically. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, but somehow she made it to the door. She stepped out of the room, into the hall, her feet dragging with every step. The cool night air hit her like a shock. The tension in her chest loosened slightly as she breathed in, trying to steady herself. The house behind her felt like a different world now, a distant memory of a time when she was still innocent, before Chris, before the blood. But even as she stepped outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over. The officers gathered near the front of the house, talking in low voices. Claire hovered near the edge of the porch, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to piece together something resembling coherence. But her mind kept racing back to Chris, his cold eyes, his cruel words, the way he had so easily torn her life apart. Then, a rustling from the bushes near the driveway. A figure moving in the shadows. Claire froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her heart pounded in her chest. There, at the edge of the yard, standing just beyond the light, was a familiar face. It was him.
Chris.
Claire's pulse spiked. Her mouth went dry, her body frozen in terror. How was he still here? How was he not? The officer near the porch turned, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. "Freeze," he shouted. "Stop right there." Chris didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Claire.
He was smiling.
Claire's stomach churned. This wasn't possible. How could he be here? "Stay back," the officer barked, but Chris didn't flinch. The darkness around him seemed to stretch, to pull him into its depths, until Claire could barely see him anymore. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Chris disappeared into the night. "Ma'am, did you see that?" the officer asked, his voice sharp. Claire could barely respond. She nodded, but it didn't feel like a real response. Nothing felt real anymore. The officer turned to his partner. "Check the perimeter. He might still be in the area." But Claire didn't hear them. Her mind was somewhere else, lost in the terror of the moment.
Chris was still out there.
And he wasn't done. The nightmare wasn't over. The night air felt colder now, sharper, as if the world itself had turned against her. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing through her veins. She could still see Chris's face, his cold, mocking smile, etched into her mind like a scar. He was alive, and he was coming for her. The officers moved quickly, shouting orders to each other, but Claire couldn't focus on them. Her thoughts were spinning out of control. How had he survived? How had he gotten away? "Ma'am, are you okay?" one of the officers asked, his hand resting on her shoulder. But Claire didn't hear him. Her eyes were fixed on the shadows, scanning the dark, waiting for Chris to emerge again. "Stay inside," the officer said, more urgently this time. "We've got a perimeter set up. We'll find him." But Claire couldn't stay. She couldn't sit still. The house felt like a cage now, its walls pressing in on her. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, sent her nerves on edge. Chris was still out there, somewhere, hiding in the darkness, watching. She needed to leave. She needed to escape. Before he found her, her legs shook, but she pushed herself to move. She turned and rushed back toward the house, desperate for something, anything, that could make her feel safe. But when she reached the door, something caught her eye. The front gate. It was open. The rusted iron bars that usually kept the driveway sealed shut were swinging in the wind, half open. Her breath caught in her throat. She had locked that gate hours ago. Her mind screamed at her. No, he'd been inside the house before, and now he was leaving, taking something. Someone. A feeling of dread filled her stomach. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward, past the officers, moving toward the gate. "Ma'am, please," one of the officers called, his voice panicked. But Claire was already through. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she crossed the driveway, the darkness swallowing her whole. She moved quickly, but her steps felt heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to pull her down. Her breath was shallow, uneven. The cool air bit at her skin, but she didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything but the terrible certainty that something was wrong. The night was quiet, too quiet, and that's when she saw it. A car parked at the edge of the driveway, its headlights off, engine running. Claire's stomach twisted in fear. She knew it. She had to know. As if guided by instinct, she approached the car slowly. Her mind raced through all the possible outcomes, but she couldn't stop.
She had to see.
The car was black, sleek. She could barely make out the shape of a figure in the front seat. Then the figure turned. It was Chris. His eyes met hers through the windshield, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Claire felt a rush of adrenaline as her body tensed. Then Chris smiled. It was the same twisted smile she had seen before, the smile of a man who had already won. "Come with me, Claire," he said, his voice low and calm, as if everything was perfectly normal. "I've made a place for us." A place for them? Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet felt glued to the ground. Every cell in her body told her to get away, to go back to the officers, but she couldn't move. She was frozen. "I'll protect you," he said again, his smile widening. "You'll see. You don't have to be scared anymore." Claire's breath hitched in her throat. Her body screamed for her to flee, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. Why is he doing this? Why is he still here? "Claire," he said again, his voice soft. "You're mine now. You always were." She shook her head, slowly, but her body didn't respond. Her legs were like lead. "I never wanted this," she whispered, but the words came out strangled, as if they were fighting to escape. Chris's face darkened for a moment, his lips curling in disgust. "Then why did you let me in, Claire?"
His words hit her like a slap.
Her body trembled with the sudden, sharp realization of the truth. She had let him in. She had let him seduce her, manipulate her. She had let him control everything. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't going to let him win.
Not like this.
With a burst of energy she didn't know she had, Claire turned and ran. She didn't care where she was going, she just had to get away. Behind her, she could hear the engine of the car roar to life. But Claire didn't dare look back. Her footsteps pounded against the gravel as she sprinted toward the house, the officers' voices faint in the distance. She could hear Chris's car start up, but she kept running. She wasn't going to stop until she was safe. Claire's breath was ragged, her chest burning as her feet pounded the gravel driveway. The cold night air sliced through her, but she barely noticed. All she could focus on was getting away, the sound of Chris's car engine behind her growing louder, closer. She could hear the tires screeching as it accelerated, and a sickening thought ran through her mind. He was chasing her. She reached the front door of the house, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the handle. It wouldn't open.
Locked.
Her heart hammered in her chest, panic creeping in. She turned, expecting to see the headlights of Chris's car flashing in the distance, but the night was dark, still.
Too still.
No sound. No movement. The driveway was empty. Her pulse quickened. Had he stopped? Had he given up? But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw the silhouette of the black car, slowly creeping around the corner of the mansion, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator stalking its prey. Her throat constricted, a sob rising in her chest. Why? Why was he still doing this? What did he want from her? With a final, desperate lunge, Claire shoved the door open. It slammed behind her as she stumbled inside, her hands shaking violently. The house felt like a tomb now, cold, silent, lifeless. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. She didn't know what to do, where to go. Her eyes darted around, looking for any escape, any safe place. Her feet carried her, almost by instinct, down the hallway, past the grand staircase, to the back of the house. She needed to lock herself in. She needed to hide. Her hand reached the back door, but before she could even touch the handle, she heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, but it froze her in place. A whisper. "Claire." Her blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable.
Chris.
She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway stretched before her, dark, empty, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. "Claire?" The voice came again, but this time it was closer. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. There was nothing, yet she could feel his presence, feel him in the very walls, the very air. Her legs shook beneath her, but she forced herself to move. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let him find her again. With a frantic glance, she saw a door ajar on her right, one of the rooms she rarely used. She rushed toward it, slipping inside and closing the door behind her. Her back pressed against the cold wood, her eyes wide with terror. The room was dark, save for the dim light filtering in through a small window. Old furniture sat scattered about, forgotten pieces from another time. Claire moved quickly, silently, to the far corner, crouching low to the ground, barely breathing. Her pulse echoed in her ears, her heart a frantic drumbeat. She could hear the footsteps now, faint but deliberate. They were slow, methodical. Chris was searching. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tense, as the sound of his footsteps drew nearer. The door creaked open slightly, and Claire froze, her eyes glued to the crack between the door and the wall. There was a shadow, a figure standing just outside. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the door pushed open, just enough for him to slip inside. It was Chris. He stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the dark room, a sinister smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Claire," he said, his voice dripping with sweetness. "Why are you hiding from me?" Claire's heart nearly stopped. She could see him now, the faint outline of his figure in the dark. He was playing with her. She knew it. He was enjoying this. His smile widened as he stepped forward, each movement slow, deliberate. "I told you," he murmured. "You're mine." Claire's breath quickened as she backed away. There was no escape. But then, as if by some miracle, her hand brushed against something cold and hard, the old brass candelabra, left untouched on the windowsill. Her fingers closed around it, the heavy weight comforting in her grasp. "Stop," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not yours." Chris's eyes flickered with something dark, anger, frustration, and that sickening grin. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Claire," he said softly. His hand reached out toward her. In one swift motion, Claire swung the candelabra. It connected with his face, with a sickening thud. Chris staggered back, blood spurting from the side of his head. His eyes widened in shock, his hand flying to his face. But Claire didn't stop. She couldn't stop. With a scream of fury, she swung again. And again. Each blow was a release, each strike a small piece of her reclaiming control. He crumpled to the floor, his body twitching, his breath ragged, but Claire didn't stop. She kept hitting, kept fighting, until he lay still. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire stood over him, panting, her hands slick with blood. Her mind was a blur, everything moving in slow motion. She didn't know how long she stood there, staring at his lifeless body, but when she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "It's over." The words hung in the air, heavy, final. But even as she stood there, the blood still fresh on her hands, Claire knew one thing for certain. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Claire's mind was a whirlwind of terror, her heart racing in overdrive as she sprinted through the dense forest. The dark trees seemed to close in around her, each branch reaching out like skeletal hands trying to drag her back into the nightmare. The faint glow of moonlight was the only thing that kept her from losing all sense of direction, but she couldn't trust it, not anymore. He was still out there. She could feel Chris's presence in the air, his gaze sharp and cold, stalking her. The quiet was unbearable, the only sound the pounding of her heart and the rustle of leaves underfoot. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. Every instinct told her if she did, he'd be there, close, waiting. Her feet burned, her legs screamed with exhaustion, but she pushed on. She had no choice. The fear of what he would do to her if he caught her again was worse than anything her body could endure. Then, through the trees, a flicker of light. It wasn't the moon. It was headlights. A car. The relief was instant, suffocating. Help. I'm almost there, Claire stumbled forward, her hands outstretched toward the bright headlights. Her breath caught in her throat as she neared the clearing. She saw the police car parked near the edge of the road, its officers standing by, their backs to her, unaware of the danger just behind them. But as she reached the road, the sound of footsteps stopped her dead in her tracks. She didn't need to look to know it was him. The hair on her neck stood up.
Chris.
Claire. His voice was a whisper, chilling and filled with venom. Her body froze. The officers hadn't noticed yet. She could still make it, she could still escape. But every fiber of her being screamed that she wasn't going to make it. Not with him so close. Chris stepped forward, his figure emerging from the shadows like a phantom, his grin wide and twisted. The officers finally turned, their eyes wide with shock. One reached for his gun, but Chris was faster, much faster. In the span of a heartbeat, he lunged. Claire didn't think. She acted. She shoved one of the officers toward Chris with every ounce of strength she had left, sending him crashing into the other officer. Without waiting to see if they could stop him, Claire bolted forward, her hands reaching out to the open door of the police car. She yanked it open, diving inside, slamming it shut just as the engine roared to life. For a second, everything went silent. She looked through the rearview mirror, her heart sinking as she saw Chris still standing there, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His expression was something worse than rage, it was cold satisfaction. He knew she had just escaped. But it wasn't over. It wasn't even close. The police car sped off, its tires screeching against the gravel. But Claire knew, he'd be back, He would always be back. And there was no place in the world far enough to escape him now.